Joining me now for this podcast is the author of several fantastic footballing books, Jim Keoghan. And Jim, first and foremost, I just want to extend an apology because it was around late last year when I was sort of sourcing guests for potential podcasts that I asked you to come on the pod. And little did I know how much of an impact my dissertation was going to have on me when I ended up getting caved in with so much sort of, reading and sort of writing, basically, that in terms of reading football content and whatnot, I just sort of got bogged in and just didn't really fancy much of it, which is why I think it's a great sort of situation to have you on now, because your most recent book, Everton Nine Players, One Iconic Shirt, is one of those books that's really sort of recaptured what I love about football and, more than anything, what I love about Everton. It's a fantastic book. So firstly, I mean, I guess you've probably explained this 100 times over since the book come out. What was it like delving into the archives to read about such great figures?
It was great. I think what's nice, especially at the moment when things haven't been great at Everton for quite a few years, it's always nice to go back and just go over our great times. And most of these players are covered in these books. Not all of them, but most of them. Their careers coincide with great times for the club, and so it's just nice to kind of reacquaint yourself with the fact that Everton, have been a fantastic club, and we've had these amazing times, even if recently things haven't been that good.
Yeah, definitely. And what I wanted to say is, it was a bit of a weird one, really, because with the book, it was almost as if pretty much these were all stories that I was told before, and it kind of set me off down a rabbit hole, as you say, is revising Everton's fantastic history, which is very unique to the club, and I would say like no other, really. I went down a rabbit hole of sort of, the Everton Former Players Foundation and some of the past interviews that they'd done, and I went onto their YouTube page, and from years back, they've got basically what you'd call now the equivalent of podcasts, like hour-long interviews with former players. And I come across an interview with Derek Temple, the man who pretty much defined our 1966 FA Cup win. And he was explaining the sort of infrastructure of the squad, saying that we had a D team, a C team, a B team, reserves, and then the first team. And what I love so much about this book is my granddad played for the B team alongside Dave Hickson. And he told me, all these sort of stories that alongside Tommy Lawton, Dave Hickson was like the finest header of a footballer that you've seen. And of course, he said he saw the back end of Dixie too. So I was wondering, for you, was there any sort of knowledge that you've come across that surprised you when researching the book?
Well, there's always stories that you didn't realise, but I think the thing that that struck me when doing the research was how seamless Everton used to be. How the sense that obviously there were gaps in between them, and there were players who kind of didn't do the business, but from Dean onwards, there's this sense of we have these fantastic number nines, and just as that person's career is dipping, in comes somebody else, and we sort of roll from Hickson into Pickering, into Young, into Royal, and Latchford, and Sharp, and Gray, and then Ferguson. It's only really maybe in the last 15, maybe 20 years where we haven't done that. There's kind of long tradition of sourcing these fantastic players in that position. Just hasn't really happened. And we've, if you look back, maybe since Kevin Campbell, the Everton forward line's been really choppy and changing. You might get a season out of somebody, and you might get maybe 12, 13 goals here and there. But that sense of having a player who can come in and just, dominate for like 6-7 years and give you 20 goals, it's just gone, really.
Devastating, really, isn't it? And from my perspective, I was born in 1998, and as you say, from Kevin Campbell onwards, it has been really hit and miss in regard to the centre forwards that we brought in. I was thinking as a sort of just a bit of a fun question, really. When you look at this current crop of players, I've done some thinking towards this, and I think I've got quite a decent answer. If you obviously, I think Dean, hands down, is the poster boy for Everton number 9. He is and always will be. I think it's something like 383 goals in 433 appearances, which is just ludicrous, absolutely ridiculous. If you could pick one of these number 9s to go into this current squad of players, aside from Dean, who would you go for?
It's a hard question. I mean, they could all improve this team. That's the kind of the really frustrating thing. There's no, as good as our forwards have been in the last few months, but not since the restart, but certainly since Ferguson took over as caretaker. I think every player in this list would improve the Everton side. I think the one that often sticks out, just because he was the best, maybe not the best out-and-out goal scorer, but maybe the best footballer amongst that list would be Alex Young. He's the one that people talk about as being probably the best Everton footballer ever. Even though his kind of goal scoring record it's not as good as the rest, but if you put somebody that creative into this team, especially when you look at our problems with going forward and creating chances, he would undoubtedly make it a better side.
Yeah, 100%. That was my pick as well. He seemed like a maverick, didn't he? Really, just a really unique technical footballer.
Yeah,
and
brilliant.
I know. I went back and watched the Golden Vision the other night as well as part of this little history binge that I've been on. It's a sensational piece of filmmaking, and his character is like the little snippets of the interviews that they do with him. His character, him as a person, was really intriguing. Like he really did seem to have like a sense of perspective as an individual, didn't he?
Yeah, I think it's that kind of documentary or I mean sort of film stroke documentary. It really captures the man who kind of he's really interesting because he seemed to have like doubts and he didn't really buy into the the sense of him being the golden vision. He was quite humble and it was a weird contrast. You have the fans sort of lionizing him and the whole piece talking about this wonderful, amazing player, and yet you have those interviews, and he just seems really not insecure, but really kind of unsure of just how good he is.
Yeah, he really seemed to have his feet on the ground, so to speak. And what kind of shocked me, as I said when asking you there, what shocked you about sort of when you were doing your research? What shocked me is like I knew Patrick was always a sort of stern and authoritarian person as a manager, but I didn't realise just how much he'd impacted for example, Alex Young's career. Because didn't at one point he block a move to New York as Royal was coming in? For a manager to do that really sort of shocked me. When you sort of look back over these periods, obviously they're very as you say, they are very sort of glorious in a sense, the 60s and the 80s. We always seem to do a sort of rebuild, don't we? As the sort of success of one era peters out, we always look to do a rebuild. And I don't know, obviously with Patrick being a former player and with Howard Kendall being a former player, maybe that's something that, the latter's learnt off Patrick. But what are the sort of things that jump out most to you in terms of when you revise Everton history? What sort of intrigues you the most?
The thing that kind of it both kind of surprises me and it's also disappointing at the same time is the sense that Everton were once very good at doing things. So if you go back to the club's foundation, I mean, of course there were mistakes and there were periods when things didn't go too well, but by and large, we were quite a forward-looking club and we invested well and we developed the club well. And then you get this kind of watershed moment just before the start of the Premier League. And then from that point on, we just flip and become a club who almost excel at making mistakes. And and we do it at the wrong time, just as our football's changing beyond recognition and money's coming in, we decide to have like, I don't know, about 6, 7, 8 years of just being completely shit at everything. and then that sense of being, and we'd always been an elite club, always been a massive club, and then we just by doing that shift, everything changes, and we fall right off the pace to the point now where like many of us feel, are we ever gonna get back to what we were? And possibly not. And it's really sad that a club that was so, so forward thinking, so excellent at so many things, just became just really shit at so much.
I mean, for yourself, as someone sort of that lived through the 90s, I was hoping maybe in a bit you could sort of educate me on it. As I say, I was born towards the latter end and didn't experience any of it. But something that I remembered that I wanted to ask, just on the topic of the number 9 book, I wanted to talk about the anomaly of Romelu Lukaku, really, because for me, by far, I would say he's the best striker that I've seen in an Everton shirt. No one else really sort of springs to mind. I remember when Jelavic came in and had that sort of goal scoring spree, but then sort of defenders sort of figured out how to man mark him out the game, and he was never quite the same again. But what I wanted to ask was, are you in a sense glad that Romelu Lukaku didn't receive that number 9 shirt?
You mean for the book?
Yeah. Well, I don't think he would have been written about anyway, because for me,
no.
As I said, I was raised on the stories of the 60s and the 80s, and just my personal opinion. But I think to be considered a legend for this football club, you have to lift silverware. You've got to win something. So in that sense, I wouldn't regard Romelu Lukaku as coming anywhere close to being, written in the history books. But from yourself, obviously, you sort of as petty, because as you say in the book, there's almost a prototype for an Everton number 9, isn't there, really, in terms of his stature and style of play, and he seems to tick all of those boxes. But from a personality perspective, I mean, I'm talking largely here about the international breaks where he talked to the media. Are you glad in a sense that he didn't get that hallowed shirt?
Yeah, I think the difference between him and lots of these players, apart from they were loved. I think we sort of respected Lukaku for his footballing ability. I don't think he was particularly loved because of the way he was, because of the way he talked about the club on those breaks, and agitating for a move quite often. Whereas players like Ferguson and Sharp, Rashford, they were properly loved by the fans, and I think that's the main difference. Even if he'd won something with Lukaku, I still don't think, and he'd worn that shirt, I still think it'd be hard to include him in the same company because his relationship with the fans was very different.
And very much that. I mean, again, I hate to say it, but that sort of stepping stone mentality, like you did see him come in after that season with West Brom and grow as a player. You would have wished that his sort of personality would have been more in tune with that, in a sense. But moving on to something else, obviously I've graduated, well, not graduated yet, but I've finished uni now, my 3rd year, waiting on graduating. I basically studied football business and media, which has kind of primed me for a career in sports media. I've always been a huge reader of football books, football autobiographies, magazines. Of reading and writing, it's something that I've always done. And so to have the opportunity to talk with an author is something I'm really grateful for. What started off you becoming an author, and what sort of lit the flame for you for that to be a defining career for you?
Well, I've been writing for about just over 20 years since I did like a master's in history, and I was trying to go into like academia, but in the end it just bored me so much. I thought I can't finish doing that. I enjoyed like the creative process and writing, so for years I just kind of wrote freelance magazine stuff and marketing stuff, but I didn't like the grind of pitching and and getting rejected and that kind of stuff. I like the idea of just doing the same thing each day, like a proper job, which is why kind of books appeal to me. But my main interest is obviously football. I've written a lot of football articles and done interviews, and if I'm going to do something every day, I'd rather it be football. So I kind of, about 4 or 5 years ago, I noticed that there was like a lot of activity in the kind of the supporter activism part of the game, but not a lot. But there was nothing written about it. Like, there's huge upheaval in like what it means to be a football supporter across the game. It was largely ignored, and you had like clubs like Wimbledon and FC United Manchester that are doing amazing things, but they were, often on the periphery. So that's where the idea for my first book came, which is punk football. And once I'd done that, I realised just how enjoyable it was to really get kind of stuck into a subject. And from that point on, that's what I want to do all the time, really.
Nice. As I say, it's something that really, like, through my sort of early childhood, really, it's something some people have always said that, that's something I can definitely see you going into in terms of like writing, and not just given how much I consumed and I enjoyed football. And on that first book, or punk football and supporter activism, I know a few lads that play for FC United of Manchester, and it is really interesting to see how they operate as a club, and how, I mean, especially now during the pandemic, how they struggle through having no commercial partnerships or links or what have you. My dissertation was basically on sort of, I suppose, the other side of that, really focused on how football essentially has changed following the investment of broadcast media post '92, and the sort of increase of foreign ownership and private ownership as a sort of consequence of that. So when you sort of look across how football's changed over time, because most definitely I often think I would have loved to have been about in, say, the 60s onwards, where football is very much a working man sport. How have you sort of observed that change over time, especially through doing your research on your book?
Yeah, well, I think you've got like, I mean, the obvious things you see, like the wages and ticket prices, the headline stuff that everyone talks about, that, that money has changed the game and footballers earn more than used to, and things become more corporate. I think one of the kind of depressing aspects is that how kind of top heavy it is, how the money, it's not a case that kind of English, I mean, clearly overall English football is better off financially, but most of that money is just skewed towards a really tiny elite, which kind of mirrors what's happened in society. You've got this kind of small number of small band of clubs who are taking the majority of the wealth, and then when you go down the pyramid and you go down into junior football, every club is living hand to mouth, and they're basically on their arse. And you're thinking, it wouldn't, simply like with this pandemic, I'm sure a lot of clubs have found this so hard because there is no income. And so, how do a club that survives, week to week, hand to mouth, function when there's no money coming in? I think it's depressing that. I know you can't have like a total sharing of income. That would never happen. But it's depressing just how much the elite hoard to themselves and how much they refuse to give to the pyramid below them. That really, it creates the game. It's the foundations of football, and they don't recognise the contribution that these clubs make to English football. They just want to kind of hoard everything themselves and get richer and richer. And it's just a really kind of depressing state of affairs.
Yeah, that sort of commodification of, as you say, the sort of top end football clubs, I would say, sort of evolving into brands. Was that one of your main sort of conclusions from writing your first book?
Yeah, I mean, I've written one this year too called How to Run a Football Club, which sort of looks at the pyramid. It goes from junior football up to the very top, and it talks about that process. How, you're right, you've got at the top, you've got these brands. Really, they're not, I'm not even sure you can call them clubs anymore. They sell a football experience to the world, and they'll have more fans in different countries than they have kind of in their own city or kind of area. And you buy into, you buy into the Liverpool experience. You don't need it. Are you necessarily the same fan as would have been the case in the 70s? I don't think you are. You kind of you wear your supporter affiliation lightly. You don't really, you go in there for the kind of the tourist experience of Anfield. It's not the same as going to Anfield in the 80s. It's just different. football at the very top is not the same as football decades ago. Whereas if you go to maybe a League One or League Two club, then that kind of sense of continuity is still there. But at the very top, it's a completely different sport now.
Yeah, most definitely. And I could echo that. I've got like connections, and I've worked at several clubs in the EFL, like League Two, League One, and that. And you can tell they're sort of dependent on match day income, and that sort of, that sense they are a real community hub, and they always will be, and sort of depend on that stream of supporters and the income that they provide. But to fast forward, and something that I'm sort of all ears towards now, really, Everton in the 90s. I know you've written that book, Highs, Lows and Bakayokos. So, as I said, I was raised basically off stories of, both sides of my family, really, of, John Moores in the 60s, the Mersey Millionaires, just how successful that we were there, and the beautiful football that we used to play, and how once player in that side, Howard Kendall's come in and led us to our most successful days in the 80s. So the prospect, or the thought of having to experience that 90s must have been so traumatic. And I hold us to exceptionally high standards, really. The fact that we're in the bottom half of the table at the present moment, it just does not sit well with me at all. And I personally think it's unacceptable. And I suppose that for someone that was there and experienced the 90s, that would add a real sense of perspective when you're sort of sizing up what you expect from the football club.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I think if you've lived through the glory years and you know what that feels like, and then you've got the mediocrity of today, it's definitely hard to take. But I think the 90s did a real number on us as fans. I don't really think. Well, I can speak personally. I don't think I've ever really got over it, because it was such a dramatic fall from grace to go from being champions to relegation fodder in space of 6 years. It really, and then to have maybe a decade where it was mostly shit. I mean, obviously we had the cup win, but most of the time we were always looking down rather than looking up. And I don't think I've ever really got over that. Really, I think each season now, I still go into it hoping we don't get pulled into the bottom three at some point, rather than thinking, are we going for Europe? And as soon as there's a turn of form, we start getting sucked down. I, like a lot of Blues, panic. I think outside Everton, people don't see us that way. They think we aren't going down. But I think a lot of Evertonians, because of what happened that decade, they really kind of lose their minds as soon as things are going badly. I think we're going down, we're fucked. And it's I blame those 10 years, because it was such a weird, traumatic fall from grace. It doesn't often happen to kind of elite clubs. Normally they just stay elite clubs. So we us, like maybe Leeds, one of those clubs, it's horrible thing happened, and it messes with your head a bit.
I guess so. See, again, I hate the prospect of being grouped in with that sort of. Obviously, being a football fan, the club that you support is subjective, and the sort of emotions that you attach to that are subjective. So I say this with no disrespect to Leeds or Aston Villa or any of those other clubs, but I hate the thought of being considered in that bracket of clubs, really. I mean, as I said, when I was born in 98, I know Walter Smith was our manager, but my earliest recollections are of David Moyes. I've met David Moyes before. I said to him, thank you very much for pulling us out of the mess that we were in the 90s. But from sort of my childhood experiences, that sort of, yes, albeit punching above our weight, but being in contention for the Europa League, getting fourth that year, that very much sort of defines my experiences of Everton as a child, really, and what I've come to expect growing older. It was something that I wanted to ask, again, something that I didn't experience. I did a little bit of reading on it last night and was quite shocked at what I found, really. But Peter Johnson, as owner, What was that like?
Mm.
I read that he was a match going Liverpool fan, which I'm sure didn't go down well at the time.
No, I don't think he was ever liked. I think he came in. I think he was the wrong sort of owner. I think Everton, we sort of got like a football league owner just as the Premier League started. So he didn't have like bottomless. I think you can forgive most things in an owner, even being a red shite, if he had bottomless amounts of money and he just splurged recklessly and did at Chelsea. But he didn't. He kind of came in and he splurged for a bit, and then he just closed the checkbook when it didn't think things weren't going well, borrowed loads of money, got us in trouble, and then fucked off. So
Mm.
like he was just like he did he did everything wrong really. Just aside from being a red, he was a really shit owner as well. So like it was by the end of the Johnson era when we almost gone down against Coventry. He'd flogged Ferguson without telling the manager. We were in hock for millions of pounds. We were buying players like Bakayoko, and the club was just, it'd gone from being mediocre to being a mess,
Mm.
and nobody wanted to buy us. And that was his legacy. He left a club that was so unappealing. And it's a Premier League club that nobody wanted to buy. So it's, to say that then when, there were all sorts of different clubs, he left a really poisonous legacy at Everton.
Is that why, for people like yourselves, players like Ferguson had such a lasting impact? Because for after as you just described there, a sort of serial mismanagement at a higher level of the club, and you get someone who comes in there, and Duncan Ferguson. Obviously, there's a long list and history of Scottish affiliates that have come through and represented Everton really, really well. But is that why Ferguson means so much to people like yourself who were there and experienced the 90s?
Yeah, definitely. I think he was just what we needed, because prior to him coming, not only had we been a bit of a laughing stock after what happened with the Mike Walker experience, and we're also quite like a small. We'd always been we turned it into quite a small team, but loads of small, tidy players, and we were dismissed by the team. Then suddenly you get this massive Scot who's violent and really aggressive, and really wears his heart on his sleeve, and he's scoring really important goals, and he's helping us haul ourselves out from the relegation zone, and then we win a cup with him playing. For Evertonians back then, I mean, even though like Ferguson, he wasn't that good. He didn't score that frequently. He was always bloody injured. He was always suspended. And he had months in prison. We never got to see the player he could be. But despite all that, he was just what we needed. There was nothing. It was being so bad, and suddenly this throwback from another age coming in. It's obvious why he's so loved.
Would you, he come in as taker manager for that game against Chelsea? And I was there at Old Trafford as well when he was caretaker at Old Trafford. Would you say that? Because I remember speaking to Clive Tilsley, who sort of described that game as a sort of real throwback to like the 80s. Would you sort of agree with that?
Yeah, I think that the Chelsea game in particular, that was like it was. I mean, I think if Ferguson stayed in charge for much longer, I don't know how much more the players could take, because they just ran and ran and ran. I mean, I think they were all picking up knocks, weren't they, as the weeks went by, because they were so, knackered. But it was a proper, like, gutsy performance, and I think that was something that all the great Everton sides had. It wasn't, obviously they were great footballers, and if you watch back all matches of like the Kendall era, that they're a fantastic footballing team. But they really gave a shit as well. They were putting loads of effort, and they weren't nasty. I think that was one of the nicest things about the Kendall sides, that they were really shitty as well to other teams. That there's a great bit in that Howard's Way documentary when I think it was Brian Marwood injures Adrian Heath, and he's out, a terrible injury, he's out for months. And so the Everton players not only got him back in that game, but every time they faced Marwood in games afterwards, they also went for him because they were really together and united and really, really aggressive. And that was, that Chelsea performance felt like that. It felt like it turned Goodison into like a place you wouldn't want to go. But I'm just not sure how long they could keep that up.
And you can sort of see that now through obviously, pandemic and Project Restart aside, you can see the sort of the list of injuries that we're getting at the moment. Like, even sort of historically though, reading through your book, it does seem like almost a characteristic of the club to just be on that side of misfortune, really. The sort of the injury history of the likes of Dean, Hickson, as you say, like Ferguson, like again, it goes back to that phrase Everton that, which just seems to be prominent now, which I know a lot of fans don't like. But overall, assessing our history, would you say we are a lucky side or unlucky side?
I think we're really unlucky. I think the kind of the one thing that sticks out in my mind is to have two great sides ruined by world wars. I know there were worse things about the world war than Everton's misfortunes, but to have those two ruined and then our greatest ever side sort of unpicked by a European ban,
no fault of our own,
that was caused by our neighbours. So we've lost really three sides to wider misfortune, and there's no other club who can say that. So, there's always bits of kind of misfortune and players who have had injuries and about, but fundamentally those three things always stick out. That you couldn't write that. It's just so unfair, And not just that, there are times when we could have been so much better. It's like, league challenges that just fell by the wayside because of this, because of that. If you look at Everton's history, we should have won way more league titles, way more FA Cups.
The 70s seemed sort of reminiscent of that. We seemed to come close so much in the 70s,
I think there was one league challenge where we lost twice to Carlyle, who went down. So if we'd beaten Carlyle, who everyone fucking did, we'd have won the league. But Everton, being Everton, managed to blow that. And there's the League Cup, and we have 2 replays and still can't win it. And there's so many more trophies we should have won, and so many more Everton sides who could have gone on to done greater things. And a lot of it is just it's just bad luck.
As I'd say, certainly in my lifetime, it's mad to think our only final is 2009, the FA Cup against Chelsea, where we've come so close in so many other semi-finals and really should have seen it over the line in those other semi-finals. That as you say, we should have won so much more than what we actually had. But what I wanted to say is that I think this sort of stuck out to me when you look at the 90s with Everton. Obviously, the revolution of English football comes in 92 with the influx of the broadcasting monies from Sky and whatnot. And as you say, that seems to be the moment when we just got our foot off the ball. And in a moment, I think this is typical of not just football. I think this will go across any industry, really, that in a moment of sort of revolutionary change, when something is, never going to be the same again, there is always the chance, and everybody always runs the risks of losing some of those traditional values that are really sort of valued. And I think that's really prominent today, really, with the sort of, I don't know quite how to describe it, but know whether that's down to recruitment or, some of the past appointments managerially. But you've obviously written that book. Was it the 50 Greatest Games?
Yeah.
You've obviously sort of gone back to the early days there. What were the sort of things that emerged to you most, the sort of values of the football club?
I think they've always been a good community club, Everton. I think, I think that's still the case now. Is that they're still very much invested in the local area. I think, as I said before, we were always well run. and we're always engaged with the community. It's only lately where that hasn't been the case. I think you're right. There's a sense lately of maybe a subtle shift in the kind of feeling around the club, and I think we're trying to make that transition from. But I think for too long our mentality was still a football league club in the Premier League. I think that's how Everton were run. We still had that kind of small mentality. We didn't think globally like Liverpool did, and I think we're trying to make that transition over to like to join the elite. But the danger is, as you kind of mentioned, as you do that, there's always the risk that you completely abandon what you were. And so, whilst Everton are great at the moment at the community stuff and all that's run well, you don't get the same sense from the team. It doesn't feel like an Everton team anymore. Where I think even when we were shit in the 90s, it still felt like an Everton team, just a shit Everton team. And I think under Moyes, that still felt that you still had that sense of the players caring what the fans think and being engaged and kind of emotionally connected to the fans. Because you look at a lot of the players we've got now, which, like you said, it could just be recruitment, but you don't feel like they really give a shit. I mean, some of the strolling, lazy performances. And I know it's the end of the season, and I know it's a weird season, but it's been there before that as well. And there's lots of players they've brought in who you don't like them. You don't get the sense they care that you don't like them. They're just getting the paycheck. And so I think managing that transition to have to be a massive elite brand, still connected locally, still cares to the community, and still can produce teams who you really engage with and kind of have emotional connection to. I think it's quite hard.
Yeah, most definitely. Something that I picked up on there when you sort of pointed to sort of, I hesitate to say mentality, but we were sort of operating as a football league club within the Premier League. Wasn't Philip Carter on the board of the Football League prior to rebranding? Yeah, do you think that was a sort of byproduct of that, maybe?
I think that kind of shows you how criminal our mismanagement was, because we were one of the teams pushing for the Premier League. We had our chairman as kind of real pushing force, and who should have seen what was coming, but everyone else did, or our peers did, and they sort of transitioned well. And yet Everton, despite having that sort of advantage over everyone else, just did nothing. Just thought, we'll just keep doing what we've been doing. It's worked for 100 years. Surely it'll work for 100 more. And it definitely didn't. And it's it's taken, probably with the arrival of Mashiri, it's probably taken that long to really start trying to, think more commercially and try and get better deals in place. And you're playing catch up now, because everyone else who was around us at the time in the 80s, like Arsenal, United, Liverpool, they just raced ahead. About 20 years ahead of us, and it's how'd you catch up? How'd you catch up them after all those decades of doing not much?
That's strange to think that, because I'm sure when I was doing revision for my dissertation, I'm positive Everton were amongst those that were represented with a meeting with Greg Dyke. I think at the time he was the chairman of ITV Sports, and sort of this was the sort of seeds being sown for the birth of the Premier League, and how there's going to have a sort of interdependent relationship with Sky and other broadcasters, that Everton were still considered at that time amongst the elite. So it is very disheartening, but onto sort of more positive pastures, really. As you say, historically, as I said to you, sort of initially, reading the book really sort of cheered me up in a sense, in that we were obviously former sort of leaders in our field. There was sort of nobody else like us, and we were so far ahead, as I said, with the likes of John Moores. And I'm sure in one of the former Players Foundation interviews that I was watching, they said we were the first of the groups, the first of the teams to bring in like strength and conditioning work and things like that. When you were writing the book of our 50 greatest games, which of the games stick out for you as the most poignant?
I think with those sort of games, it tends to be if you were there. I think so. Like my favorite game, it shouldn't be really, but my favorite game is always the Wimbledon 3-2 kind of the escape from the clutches of death game, because it's got everything in it. That game, don't think that. I've been there when Everton have won titles, and that's fantastic. And I've seen us win cups, and that's wonderful. But you don't have that same swing from abject despair to like insane elation that I got in that space of an hour. I'd gone from kind of wanting to leave, and just being distraught, to like just losing my head by the end of it. You don't really get that. So that's like my favorite game, but like it shouldn't be. The greatest game should be things like Bayern Munich, or winning the league in '85, or the '66 Cup final. They're like the moments you should be saying that are fantastic, and you were. But I think for a lot of Evertonians who've been born more recently, your greatest games aren't historically great games. That's part of the problem of our modern club. When you're looking at like when I was trying to pick one from like the Moyes era, I picked like finishing fourth was like a great moment. It's a great moment.
It is. I was going to say mine would be the Gosling derby. Really, when I pick my favourite game, then it's just the Gosling derby. Case closed. I think there's just the context of that. But as you rightly say, it shouldn't be really, should it? It should be a sort of defining.
But like, it should be. But like derby wins in the '80s were like 10 a penny. So like I cut out loads of games in the '80s because there are too many games in the '80s. But when you get kind of post Walter Smith and you're looking back over the last 17 years, 16 years, the great moments, like things that used to be routine, like getting to a final or beating Liverpool. It's depressing that that's come to that, really.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think, moving on to the modern day now, I know because I think I put a tweet out the other day after the 1-1 draw against Villa, that it seems like just an inherent personality trait of Evertonians to be negative and to be very sort of pessimistic. Again, as you sort of described, I've got a feeling that might be a byproduct of those that have been there and experienced the 90s. But do you think that, for example, I think the example that football fans in general point to now when talking about Everton is that appointment of Carlo Ancelotti as manager. Do you think that is a step in the right direction, or just a stroke of luck that swung our way for a change?
I think we were lucky. I think he came, when we were looking for a manager, he happened to be looking for the job. But it's nice that the club has shown ambition for the change, because you could have gone out there and appointed Sean Dyche, or he would have done an all right job, but you wouldn't get to the next level. So it's nice that they're doing that. But again, they've done it in a typical Everton way, that we're getting you owner and we go and blow all the money, and then we appoint the good manager and say, well, there's not as much money. So yes, it's fantastic, but it wouldn't have been fantastic 4 years ago. Because imagine what he could have done, and his reputation and his knowledge and that money. Right, so we wouldn't have bought Sandro or Schneiderlin and all these kind of list. Yeah, this endless list of garbage that we've saddled the club with. That wouldn't have been the case. Probably we still would have bought our players, because every club does, but we wouldn't be looking at the team we have now and thinking, God, that's 400 million to produce that team. It's just really, we've produced a team that is worse than the side that David Moyes left us with. We spent 400 million to do that, which is such an Everton thing to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think this comes to, I would say, I mean, obviously the squad that David Moyes built up until the time just before he left for Manchester United, I don't know, it was a fantastic footballing team. I've got sort of great memories of, you know, the likes of Pina and Morales bending them in from outside the box and playing some fantastic football as a sort of product of that. But that appointment of Roberto Martinez, I think it married the sort of defensively sound team of Moyes and that sort of free thinking, progressive side of Martinez, which did lay the seeds for so much promise. And again, I mean, obviously for older people, they'll have their issues that they want to pick with the club. But for me, that decision to let Ross Barkley, Romelu Lukaku, John Stones and Gerard Deulofeu all go within the sort of same space of time, it's just sort of landed us in the situation that we are in today. We have got some fantastic players, as we said. Like, it's been great to see Richarlison and Calvert-Lewin sort of develop a relationship as the two up top, and you know they are sort of the leading the line for us, the best two players that we've got. Luca Dean, the fact that he's come in, taking the place of Leighton Baines almost seamlessly, that was a huge task to take the place of Leighton Baines. And the fact that he did it within that first season so sort of effortlessly was, you know, a credit to the club and their sort of recruitment. But as you say, it has been marred by the sort of mess everywhere else, so to speak. But again, this is such a hard question to answer. But what would you put the times? What time span would you put on us returning to that sort of elite bracket of clubs?
I don't know if we can. I mean, again, that's probably just Evertonian pessimism. I think certainly in the short term, the best you could hope for, I think, would be sort of where maybe Man U are now, where you're just outside the really good teams, and you can maybe have a cup run. I think if in the next 3 years we do that, that's fantastic. But I think more than anything, I just want some stability and the sense that we're going somewhere. I'm sick of really sick of waiting for the summer. Like every season, it's like, God, let's get to the summer and we're going to clear the decks and build again. I'm tired of like just writing off months of the season, and then the next year you're back. You know, same again. Things go wrong and you're in the bottom three and you're fighting out of it, and it gets to like March, April, you think, God, let's just get to the summer and buy some new players. I want a season or a few seasons where like that doesn't happen, and you end the season thinking we've genuinely improved, and I'm excited for the summer because we're going to get more players to get even better. Not, God, look at this shout of shit. Let's just get rid of them and hopefully we get some new players. I'm just, I want to feel like the club are going somewhere. And right now, you do because of who's in charge, but like there's still that sense that, God, this is just, it's just shit to watch at the moment. And there's so many players there, you're thinking, I just don't want to see them play for the club again.
Yeah, and I've got to be honest, right? When I look at this Premier League at the moment, there are a few finer times to get your shit together than right now, I would say.
Right.
You've got a number of those once considered very elite clubs. So for me, when I was growing up, I think there seemed to be a tendency of football fans and sports fans to sort of group the top contenders into pairs. So for the 80s, it was us and Liverpool. And then for me growing up, really, it was Chelsea and Man United. Now it's obviously City and Liverpool. But now we're in a situation where Tottenham, Man United, Chelsea, all these top sides that should be sort of, they were the sort of set in stone top six, are sort of fluctuating within the top half of the table. And you've got great examples. And my hat goes off to Wolves, really, to be honest. I think they're one of the best examples of a project club that you can find, with the sort of the recruitment that they've gone about and the sort of style of play. that they've sort of implemented now. Because as you sort of alluded to there, I think as a football fan, that's all you're waiting for. I think you're waiting for that season where it clicks for your club in terms of you're waiting for a sort of string of sound board decisions at a high level, and then you want to see that as a result on the pitch in the terms of as a definitive style of play. I think we most definitely seen that in Roberto Martinez, which I guess ultimately came to his peril. But you're going to see, you want to see a sound style of play that lays the foundations for, as you say, a decent cup run or maybe a European finish. But as you say, it is a real hard one to predict, given it being the top flight of English football. It is generally hard to predict, but going forward, obviously, tonight, in it, Sheffield United. It's Monday. We're recording this now. What time the kickoff is it? Is it another sort of tea time kickoff? 6 o'clock.
Yeah, 6.
Yeah. Again, they're another of those sides that have crazily come up, and Chris Wilder's hit the nail on the head there. They're sound and in contention for the European places. It feels very, very wrong to be saying Everton are going into a game against Sheffield United as the underdogs. To me, that should not be the case closed.
No.
But what are you sort of... I don't like asking for score predictions. I think that's a bit of a cop-out question, really. But what do you envision for the game tonight?
Did you see that interview with the manager after their last game?
Wilder?
Yeah, you see it?
Which one?
He was really... I'm not sure what it was on, but he was really candid and really pissed off with his team.
The goalkeeper was the only one that he couldn't find fault in.
Yeah. And so, you kind of watch that and you're thinking, I really feel sorry for whoever's going to play that team next, because he will have given them a proper bollocking. Already they're motivated. They're a good team. They've got a kind of a clear identity. They work hard for each other generally. Already beaten us. And they're playing an Everton team who couldn't care less, who are on the beach. I think, there are players there who know that they don't form part of the manager's plans over the next few years. So why would they bother? And you'll come up against, that former Sheffield United. I don't see Everton getting anything from the game at all. I don't think they'll get battered because it's still Sheffield United. But I've got no confidence at all. Still watch it because, it's Everton, but it's... I know it's going to be an unpleasant experience, and I'll end the game feeling shit. It's almost guaranteed, but what can you do?
Yeah, for me, it very much feels like since the project restart, I don't know. I don't know if it's sort of a product of how this season's gone in general with, again, the sort of success over Stanley Park, but I've just lost my enthusiasm, really, towards football this season. As you say, you are sort of looking to the summer and thinking, right, what can we do within the sort of extended transfer window period now to develop a sort of team with a sound identity? I don't know, it's life as the modern Evertonian, isn't it, really? But I'd be interested to sort of look at winding up the podcast now to ask you, obviously the book is on the number 9 shirt, which has a really sort of rich and unique history. But for me, as I said, my granddad played for the club during the 50s, and he was a centre half. He was number 5, and growing up, so when I played, I was a number 5. I was a centre half or a defensive midfielder. So I sort of had that sort of passed on to me, if you know what I mean. So I've always sort of kept my eye on sort of historic defenders of the club, many of which have been captains, and I think my favourite Everton player of all time is Brian LeBone in that regard, just to think how he sort of conducted himself as captain. And when you watch the Golden Vision, his interviews, they're absolutely fantastic. They are what you want an Everton captain to be. If you could take your pick of your bunch of Everton captains, who would it be and why?
I think Ratcliffe, because of what that team did and also he was just really good. You know, when you've kind of watched Everton over years and you've seen some of the shit that we've had playing in our defenses here and there, and you think back to a player, he was just so accomplished, so quick, so kind of intelligent, and you always felt confident. You know, maybe less so towards the end of his career, but that's inevitable with footballers. But certainly when he was in his pomp, he was. You just thought like nothing's going to get past him. The defense will be run properly, and he was just a really good footballer. And it's you imagine having someone like him in our team now. Just it'd be so wonderful when we've had when you look at some of our defenders who just have a look of blind panic on their faces at times, and you're thinking you could do with somebody with that level of confidence and that level of ability. And that sort of that presence as well. It's just he was just a fantastic player.
Yeah, definitely. Just another one that sprung to mind as well. Obviously, there we're talking about captains, and Seamus Coleman's been getting quite a lot of media attention recently because I think it split straight down the middle. When he comes out with a sort of a rallying cry in the media saying, this isn't good enough, half of the fans think, oh, here we go again, and then half of the fans think, good on him. That's what a captain should do. I think we're in danger now of Seamus and Leighton Baines really being grouped into the same sort of cohort as the likes of Phil Jagielka and whatnot, of great players not to have won anything for the club. Who would you consider the best Everton player to have not won a trophy in the time at the club?
Oh, that's a good question there. Well, I'd say Baines. I think Baines is one of our greatest ever players. I think he'd get into most Everton teams, even some of the ones from the 60s and 80s. He was a fantastic footballer. I think the best left back in this country over the last, certainly during his Everton career, he's been fantastic, and he could have gone elsewhere.
He could have went to Man United and won leagues and Champions Leagues.
He could have gone there, and he stayed loyal. And he's one of those players who you think deserves a trophy, but he'll have to make do with our love instead, which is not as good as a trophy probably. But he's certainly. He's one of those players who, all the ups and downs we've gone through, he's always been held in high regard. He's one of those players who you sense gets Everton as well. I think that matters too. You get the feeling that he understands what it is to be an Evertonian. But unfortunately, I think those like him and Coleman are sort of I feel like a dying breed at the club, where they're the players who, the hang up from the Moyes era. And you had that affinity with the crowd, and you can't say that to the same degree with an awful lot of the modern players.
No, 100%. Fingers crossed he does sign the extension, and just touch wood that this group of players go on and achieve something within a cup competition for his sake, or I don't know if he is wanting to go into coaching because he seems like a cool guy with a lot of different things on the agenda. But if he is to come into coaching, I'd love for him to win something on the coaching staff as well. Jim, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. You're more than welcome to come on anytime. I'm going to leave a link to the book, the Amazon link in the description. But if you've got anything else that you want to plug, I know you said you've got another book out there, so just to let the people know.
Oh yeah, there's another one coming out in 2 weeks, I think it is, How to Run a Football Club, which is, as I said before, it's the entire game from kids kicking the first ball right up to the Premier League, just to get a kind of a taste of how shit modern football is and how it's how unfair it is. So while we're all kind of enjoying our Premier League side, you forget there's so much that is just on its arse. So it's, but it's not all downbeat as well.
Well, I'll definitely be looking at getting that when it comes out. And as I say again, Jim, thanks for coming on the podcast, and you're welcome anytime.
No worries for having me.
Great.